welcome to my educational lesson materials analysis of The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle. Very Hungry Caterpillar chronicles the life of a caterpillar from egg, caterpillar, cocoon to butterfly, and he eats lots of different foods along the way. The lesson plan I chose to look at was from Scholastic Early Childhood Today. It's early ed, pre-K, kindergarten, and it just aims that the students extend the book, which sort of means that they internalize the concepts and can use what they learn for further knowledge. So the materials are what you need for a felt board, as well as some arts and crafts materials, and the lesson is broken into 4 parts. Felt board, which is usually done in a large group circle time, dramatic play, calendar and math study, and art project that draws on early literacy a bit. So the original lesson, the felt board, just uses cutouts, and the students are supposed to engage in retelling the story. The dramatic play is sort of an art and dramatic play. They create their characters, and then students take turns narrating the stories, and the story, and the children need to practice their listening skills to hold up the corresponding art. The calendar and math study builds on the felt board and is just recalling and graphing how much and which food the caterpillar ate each day. So 1 apple on the first day, 2 oranges on the second day. And then the art and literacy project starts with creating a caterpillar, and then the students are asked to create their own story about the types of foods their caterpillar likes, and then building on the caterpillars, turning them into butterflies, using collage, and then discussing Eric Carle's illustrations, which are famous in early education. So the assigned school I got is Harlan School in Everett, Mass, K through 8, and really large Hispanic student body, as well as first language not English, which we could maybe hypothesize is a lot of Spanish speakers, 43.6% English language learner, as well as lots of high need and economically disadvantaged students. So my focus is primarily on Latinx students, as well as English learners and economically disadvantaged students. I chose 3 pieces to review. The first being the guide to inclusion of immigrant origin students. So really focusing on that there is a difference between English immigrant origin students and English language learners. There's even a difference among immigrant origin students. So really being aware and not generalizing or confusing your students' experiences. And being aware that there are a lot of different factors that can shape a child through migration, but that there's also a lot of good cultural wealth that comes out of these families. And that as educators, it's really important to, educate ourselves on the culture, as well as learning in the most respectful way from families and students, really building those relationships. My favorite part of this reading was the language learning accommodations. Specifically peer matching, where English language learners are placed with someone maybe a bit farther along in their English skills, but that shares the native language, and how that builds relationships, security, and also these skills in both the native and English language. A little bit from the Tatum reading was just more about the importance of family in Latinx communities, and the language, speaking Spanish as something that's really important to many Latinx individuals. And lastly, I wanted to look a little bit about economically disadvantaged students. Again, family is really important. However, there may be more barriers to think about when working with families: multiple jobs, other children to care for without adequate childcare, And similarly to, I think, Latinx and immigrant origin students, just the educator's responsibility to take this structural ideology and really look at combating the systems that contribute to the opportunity gap, and not falling into that sort of deficit trap for our students. And lastly, partnering with families and communities to provide resources for families. Schools are a community institution, and they should be for the community and for the betterment of the families. So the framework I chose was the immigrant origin English language learner framework, but I think it applies in some ways to the economically disadvantaged students again. So first and foremost, recognizing both the strengths and challenges of your students, not falling into the deficit ideology, and really holding a deep understanding of cultural wealth that these students have. Secondly, not shying away from the importance that culture has in the classroom, using it as a means to build on, learning more from each other in terms of culture, and just putting that in the forefront. That's at the forefront of these students' lives, so it should be at the forefront of their education. And then that there's these different skills that need to be considered in responsive teaching for these students. And that the social interpersonal skills, emotional skills that are really tied to this learning can be facilitated a lot through collaboration, peer learning, and just building these relationships in the classroom um, through collaborative approaches. And then again, highlighting materials that embrace everyone and are relevant to the population. And lastly, of course, focusing on the parents, caregivers, and communities. So to revise my lesson, I changed felt board to magnet board because it made more sense. But instead of just providing this food in the story, which is very limiting to Eric Carle's view of the world, providing students with things from their own communities and lives, so menus and coupon books from establishments nearby, and then having conversations and sharing stories about what this food means to them. And then, of course, going back to the board, practicing with their own caterpillars, that exemplify everyone's uniqueness, and again, retelling the story and using their own foods and languages and cultural markers to make it really more relevant, help them build. For the dramatic play, I wanted to take it out of a large group and focus on the collaborative learning. So using that language accommodation pairing, so students can be encouraged to build their skills in both languages, and really understand and practice what that aspect of the lesson is getting at. Listening skills, comprehension, narration is all really hard to do if it's in a language you don't understand. So really just promoting the bilingual education through that one. The calendar and math study, I kind of wanted to break it out because I thought it was a little bit stale and boring, and seemed like a really good opportunity to get community and families involved. So changing it to a food bank that is providing resources that are necessary for the community, provides opportunities for families to get involved, and also still has the important early ed skills of graphing, counting, categorizing. And lastly, for the art and literacy, I wanted to break it away from just Eric Carle and bring in again relevant people to these students' lives. So displaying and talking about the work of Latinx artists helps students contextualize their own experiences and their own art, and you're still getting those literacy skills of telling stories and conversations, but also making it really stick, and showing the students all the amazing aspects of their culture and community. So the original lesson, like I mentioned, had a really strong emphasis on listening skills in English, which is obviously not accessible at a school with so many English language learners. Also focused on large group or individual instruction, which does not allow for that social, emotional, and language skill development that really comes from collaboration and peer work. It also did not center the needs or experience of diverse learners. It was very bland, just focusing on the book and not really contextualizing it in any sort of greater world view. And that so in revising my lesson, I focused primarily on strengths, not deficits. So, storytelling and oral skills, which are really important to this lesson, are also something that are utilized a lot in Latinx communities. So, providing students to do that in a way that's natural in their own language and makes sense for them. And then, secondly, really putting culture at the forefront with the bilingual instruction and native language, obviously, and also just providing materials and examples that are relevant in the community, from the community, um, and that the children have a reference point to so they can build off of. Um, Again, the social, emotional, and language skills that come from the collaboration. I wanted to focus on the smaller groups. And then lastly, the family element. I wanted to get families involved even more, but it's kind of a fine line between you don't want to penalize any student or family for not being able to participate, but you do also want to really show that you care and you're involved. So that was sort of my thinking with the food bake example. Um, Thank you so much. Here are my citations.